Sesame Street, one of America's first multiracial TV shows, grew out of LBJ's war on poverty, using media to open educational opportunities to low-income young children. Now that transformative model is helping distressed communities, including refugees around the world, and opening a powerful prism on the condition of our most vulnerable children. It's now my pleasure to talk with Sherrie Westin, Sesame Workshop's President of Social Impact and Philanthropy, and the woman behind its mission. Over 50 years ago, in the attempt to tackle President Johnson's declared war on poverty, Sesame Street took the stage. Its founders, Joan Cance Cooney and Lloyd Morissette, brought together an unlikely menagerie of warriors and emerging public television media, the artistry of the Muppets, educational scholars, entertainers, and funding supported through the federal government and nonprofits. What a magical formula that model is for the rest of us today to how best to collaborate. Together, they attack persistent and relevant cultural and social economic problems. Sherrie, it's been 50 years of this founding genius of Sesame Street, and it seems to have held. Why is that?
Well, first of all, Angela, thank you so much for including me. It's a thrill to be a part of this. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it's amazing that here we are over 50 years later with Sesame. We celebrated our 50th last year. And I really think the reason it has been so effective for, over 5 decades is that they identified a real need, a real issue that is still ongoing. That need is still there. And you're right, Sesame Street was born out of the 60s. It was the civil rights movement. It was the Johnson administration. It was the war on poverty. And it was an experiment to see if television could be used to teach. But more than that, to see if television could reach children who had less advantages of those in middle class, who had been left behind, to give them the skills to arrive at school ready to learn. So I think the fact that it was that they were the first to use media to tackle that issue. And I also think it speaks to the prescience of Joan Cance Cooney and Lloyd Morissette, our founders, because they were also the first to focus on preschool. They had a hunch that the learning would be, the investment would be the greatest there, that the return on investment. And now we have the science to prove it. Neuroscience shows that a child's brain develops more in the first 5 years of life than any other time. The other things I think are really interesting in terms of their prescience is it was also the first show that was designed very deliberately to appeal to adults as well as children. That's why Joan brought in Jim Henson and the Muppets and celebrities and musicians and parodies and humor, because she thought that the learning would be deeper if an adult were watching with a child. So again, today we have the science to prove that's precisely how a child learns, through engagement with an adult. And we know it worked. There have been over 1,000 studies on Sesame Street. We're steeped in research in all that we do, both formative research and then proving outcomes with summative research. And the fact that we know we can make absolute difference in terms of learning outcomes through now not just television, but all forms of media, is why we're still here 50 years later. And I must say, if you think of today and the power of educational media and the need to reach children with distance learning, I mean, I can't think of a time that Sesame Street is needed more, with over 1.5 billion children around the world out of school.
1 billion, yeah, I hadn't, when you think about that, 1.5 billion children, and this is just, I guess, as you use the term prescient, it really is. It's in over 150 countries now, tackling a wide range of social issues specific to specific countries, like challenges like girls' education in India, HIV/AIDS in South Africa, and humanitarian response in the Middle East and Bangladesh. And that seems to be so wonderful that around the world, people know Muppets, probably more than any other single character. They know the Muppets. What is the most critical Sesame success in other countries, and how has your founding principles guided you through this expansion in other cultures and other countries?
Well, it's true. We're now seen in over 150 countries around the world. We like to say that Sesame Street has become the longest street in the world. But I love the story that Joan Gance Cooney, soon after Sesame launched in 1969, said that she thought she had created the quintessential American show. It was a multiracial cast on a stoop in Harlem, and within a year, Brazil, Mexico, Germany all reached out and wanted their own local productions because the need for early education is universal. And, in many of those countries, we have created completely local versions. So the model remains the same, to your point. It's still combining educators with the researchers, with the creatives and the production, but specifically designed to meet the needs of children in each country. So we work with local educators, we work with ministries of education. And some of the best examples have been, as you mentioned, HIV and AIDS in South Africa with the first ever HIV positive Muppet, girls' education in Afghanistan, India, Bangladesh, where we have powerful girl role models, little Muppets who are inspiring young girls and showing little boys that it's okay for girls to go to school. But when you ask what's one of the best examples, I would have to say our more recent work in the humanitarian space with a new Arabic production called Ahlan Simsim, which means Welcome Sesame. And this came out of the fact that there were more children displaced than any other time since World War II because of the Syrian crisis. And we knew we had to do something to help. So we partnered with the International Rescue Committee, the IRC. We created this all new production, Ahlan Simpson, and it's not only television and every form of digital, but it's also direct services with the IRC and research to help prove what's most effective for children in conflict. And just as I mentioned, we create even local Muppets. If you can think about the storylines that children would be able to identify with and characters they could relate to. So in Ahlan Simpson, you will have not only Cookie and Grover and Elmo, but two new Muppets, Jod, who had to leave his home and becomes best friends with Bosma, a little purple Muppet. And so you can see we're modeling storylines of acceptance and understanding and including the critical social emotional skills that children need to thrive. So, and I have to say, coming back to your original question about why are we still around 50 years later, I think it's because of the number of firsts. That's another first. Just like in 1969, we are reaching children who have no other access to quality early learning. And together with the IRC, we're literally creating the first largest early childhood intervention in the history of humanitarian response.
And you're doing it in so many different unique ways. One of the things I'd like you to talk to everybody about is what you do with the families, what you do with the dads and the moms. So people always think about Sesame Street as a children's show and trying to work with children to help them cope. Help them, first it started with the alphabet and counting and Count Dracula, and now we're talking about how you cope with displacement, which is a far different place than numbers. But part of this is also getting to the families, to the moms and dads and to the communities. And talk a little bit about that, Sherrie.
Well, you make a good point. People think, I think they often think of Sesame Street as the letter of the day, the number of the day, of literacy and numeracy. But it has always been so much more. It's always been what we call a whole child curriculum, because from the beginning, we worked with Harvard educators, with researchers, and we know that children need the social emotional skills to thrive. Our mission is, to help children everywhere grow smarter, stronger, and kinder. And I always think that sounds like a clever tagline, but it is so true. It's smarter, yes, in the cognitive basics, but stronger in terms of resilience, in terms of health, kinder in terms of empathy and understanding. And that's what allows us to address some of the most challenging issues for children and to give tools to those adults, parents, caregivers in their lives, because that is so important when you're dealing with really challenging issues. Sesame becomes a catalyst for the engagement between adult and child, as well as the content for the child. I think for those who grew up watching Sesame Street or are old enough to remember, when Mr. Hooper died, this was
Yes.
the first time a children's show, rather than recasting Mr. Hooper, They dealt with it head on and did an entire episode to teach children about loss, grieving, and death, because we're always looking at real world issues from the lens of a child. And it's what's allowed us to tackle such tough issues, but in a child-friendly way, in a non-threatening way. We work with partners on the ground too. Most people may not realize this, but a program called Sesame Street and Communities, where we go off screen into communities working with local service providers, much like we're doing in the refugee space.
Mhm.
And so we learn from those organizations on the front lines, because we're empowering them with Sesame content, resources, videos, WhatsApp, printed pieces, whatever is most effective. And we learn from them what they're dealing with and what's needed. So that's what led to our initiatives around parental addiction, incarceration of a parent, homelessness, because we were hearing from them that there were absolutely no resources for young children. And these are issues that people don't think of as a child, an issue affecting children, and yet they do. So that is a place where we are able to work very effectively with parents and caregivers as well as children. And if I go back to Joan's prescience, that appeal to adults is a huge asset.
I think the idea that you're talking about, going through the lens of a child and then thinking about the entire child, the entire ecosystem around a child. Sherrie, tell us a little bit about your procedures of how you choose the partners and how you choose the issues. I know you do a lot with research, looking at research and cutting edge research, but you also have these cultural challenges that people are facing globally. So how do you make that decision about where you're going in?
Absolutely. It's a combination of ways. We are a research organization, so a lot of time is put into looking at trends and issues affecting children where we know we can make a difference. We can't do everything, but that's what led to our humanitarian work, because again, the largest number of people displaced since World War II, and half of whom were children. It's what led to our military family initiatives. At the height of deployment in the U.S., literally, there was an article on the front page of the New York Times that said over 700,000 families with young children were facing multiple deployments, and yet there was nothing to help the youngest members of the families understand that. There were no tools, there were no resources. And that's led to our work with military families that is ongoing, helping children deal with deployment, with a parent coming home injured or changed, even with the loss of a parent. Another one is autism. When I think about it, it was because we saw that 1 in 58 children were being diagnosed with autism. So how could we not address such a pressing issue? And it's one of my favorite initiatives. It was called See Amazing in All Children, to help destigmatize autism, but also to raise awareness and understanding. And empathy. And we even created another first, Julia, who is the first Muppet with autism. And Julia not only allows children with autism to see themselves and feel less alone, but she also helps others understand why Julia might be a little bit different. Focusing on what you still have in common. When Big Bird says to Abby that, just because Julia doesn't look you in the eye doesn't mean she doesn't want to be your friend. She does things a little bit differently in a Julia kind of way. She has autism, very direct, very clear. And I think that work can just absolutely be groundbreaking in terms of changing people's attitudes and behaviors and reducing stigma. So it's a variety of ways that we come to these issues, but as I mentioned earlier, it's also through working with partners on the ground who share with us what the needs are and what are the issues that they're seeing children struggle with. Because we know when children face traumatic issues, it literally affects their ability, their brain development, and it's so important that we give tools to those caregivers to help those children overcome those obstacles.
Sherrie, when you think about the very beginning, that's why I call sort of a magic sauce. When you had a collaboration of people who normally you would think like television and kids and education, that magic sauce is still working today because your collaboration is rich in terms of across sectors, across country. And so here, at the LBJ school, we talk about, preparing the next generation of public servants. I'm looking at Sesame Street and I'm saying, yes, this is another thing where policy and public policy, public service really makes a difference. What do you see for the future in terms of, if you're thinking about young people and people going into public service, in your whole approach and your eagerness and wisdom with regard to the Sesame Street example? How would you talk to young people today about pursuing work in public policy, whether it be in the public or the private sector or the nonprofit, because you cross all of those?
I think that it's really what I recommend is sort of multidiscipline approach, which is what you point out, that all of this in the inception of Sesame Street, it was bringing together educators, researchers, creative producers, and the idea was about addressing a need. Again, that sense of purpose. Yes, Joan and Lloyd had tremendous prescience, but it was all about focusing on a real need, and that has been consistent for 50 some years. I mean, what I see moving forward is that the need has never been greater, but there's so many, the means are changing so much since the 1960s. I was thinking about this before we got together because of the Johnson administration, the 60s. And I thought, during the time when they came up with the idea for Sesame Street, television was referred to as a vast wasteland. If you remember Newt Minow, the FCC
Yes.
chairman in the 60s. And,
Yes.
the same could be said today for social media. And what Joan Gans Cooney said, famously said, was it's not a question of whether children learn from media, it's what they learn.
Yes.
And that's true today for social media, for any form. And I think for those going into public policy, it's about what are the real needs you can address? What's a multidisciplinary approach where you can bring others together? And I also think it's about patience, that we need to be measuring success on public policy in decades, not years. We need data, but patience. It's great to have the great, big, innovative idea, but there also needs to be the, sort of grounded in research. And I think that, the one thing that gives me so much hope is when you look at students today, that sense of purpose they have, that sense of, altruism and optimism. And, that does give me hope for the future in spite of pretty daunting times.
Well, I think having the legacy and the experience and the success of Sesame Street is going to help us in a super complex world, because you're talking about media. And while we're talking about public television, then moving on, you think about social media and the impact and the ability to measure the impact through social media.
Well, listen, I think one of the greatest contributions Sesame makes is adding to the body of research on what's most effective for teaching children, remotely, but also for children in crisis, for vulnerable children. So with our work in the humanitarian space, we will more than double the amount of research on what's most effective for children in crisis. When you look at this pandemic,
Yes.
for us to be measuring impact on using WhatsApp, digital, telephone, radio, mobile, not just broadcast, but we have to be more innovative, both in high-tech and low-tech ways of reaching children. But to be able to add to the body of evidence on what's effective is an enormous contribution. And again, coming back to the prescience of Joan and Lloyd, if we can be a catalyst for others to invest in the early years, that there is very little investment in early childhood development. Even in the humanitarian space, less 3% of all aid goes to education at all. And it's only a tiny sliver for early education, in spite of all of the evidence that the return on investment in the early years has long-term outcomes. And if we can be a catalyst for more enlightenment on the importance of reaching children in those critical early years, we will make a difference for children for generations to come.
Well, Sherrie, I think you've already done that. I mean, I think the track record of Sesame Street and Sesame Workshop has been extraordinary. I think you're right. We have to think about data and evidence and how we move that data and evidence into the real world to help children. I just am so pleased that you were able to join us and share the story of 50 years of success in both in the United States and abroad. Thanks so much, Sherrie, for
Well,
spending time with us.
listen, it's my great pleasure and congratulations, because when you think what happened and what came out of the war on poverty and the Johnson administration, and so many of those issues we are still dealing with today, but it's a real inspiration on how we can approach it.
Yes, it is indeed. And you're inspirational. Thank you,
Yeah,
Sherrie, so
well, thank you.
much. I appreciate it. Thank
Okay,
you.
thanks again.
Okay.
Take care.